Hi, I'm Glyn. I'm a portrait photographer based in the UK, and in this short session I want to show you how you can take classic, timeless portraits using minimal kit and in limited space. So what do I mean by classic, timeless portraits? Well, basically I'm talking about images that when we look at them, we can't go, oh yes, I remember they were doing that look in 1990 something or 2000 and something. I'm talking about images that will stand the test of time. Beautiful images by people such as Annie Leibovitz and Yusuf Karsh that were simplistic in their technicals but expertly crafted. Images that we would have looked at years ago and gone, wow. Images that we'll look at nowadays and go, wow. And images that we'll still be looking at in 10, 20, 30 years and beyond and still be looking and saying, wow. Now, this kind of imagery, beautiful, classic, timeless portraits isn't just for the lucky people, the people with the most amazing kit and the most massive, well-kitted out studios. We can still create classic, timeless portraits using minimal kit and in limited space. Now for me, classic means Rembrandt lighting, something I thought was way beyond me when I first started out, but that's what I'm going to show you first, and then we'll look at the kit and how you can do this with a lot of space and very little. So what is Rembrandt lighting? Well, Rembrandt lighting takes its name from the famous Dutch painter Rembrandt, who lived between the 15th of July 1606 and the 4th of October 1669. Rembrandt lighting is a split lighting setup that gives light on one side of the face and shadow on the other, with the shadow side of the face having a triangular pattern of light under the subject's eye. To get that Rembrandt lighting pattern, all we need to do is use one light and one modifier. We start off by placing the light horizontal to the ground and side on to the subject. This will ultimately give us split lighting, where we have light on one side of the face and shadow on the other. But now that we have this, how do we get light on the shadow side of the face? Well, all we need to do is move the light further forward of the subject. Question is, how far? Well, all we need to do is move it just far enough so that if we stood directly next to the light and modifier with our head against it and looked at the subject, if from there we can see the cheek on the shadow side of the subject's face, then it means that part of the modifier can as well, and so light will land on it. If we need more light, we move it further forward, but we might also need to increase the power of the light as we're moving it further away. Now, if you want to get that perfect triangular lighting pattern, then we can get that from simply adjusting the height and the angle of the light and modifier. And that's it. Of course, you don't need to do the split lighting part every time. That's just a way of breaking down the technique. Once you know it, you can go straight into placing the light to the side and forward of the subject. Now, when I'm out taking portraits, I find myself quite often in places where there's lots of space and places where there isn't that much at all. So here's a typical look at the kind of kit that I always take with me. Now, at the time of recording this, I'm using a Sony a7R II camera, but I'm upgrading in the very near future to the a7R IV, and that's purely because of some technology that it has that will make my life taking portraits a lot easier, as opposed to just getting it just because. Now, lenses I often use are a 55mm prime and an 85mm prime. I've got a portable background which is made by Westcott. It's called the X-Drop, and the one I use is actually called the Glyn Vintage Grey, and in the UK that's available from Carmarthen Cameras. The X-Drop packs down nice and small, making it very portable, and it's of course very, very light. Now, the lighting all depends really. If we're talking about the portraits I've been taking for the past couple of years of World War II veterans for my 39 to 45 portraits project, then I typically use a 4AA battery speed light. However, for times when I know I'm going to need more power, I use the Westcott's FJ400, which is a studio style light, but has the battery attached to it, so you don't need a power source to plug it into. The modifier I use is typically the Westcott large octa. It's the rapid box switch. Now, over the past few years, I've made some drastic changes to the kit that I'm using, but also to how much kit I'm using. And I think that's probably come because of, certainly, like I say, over the last few years, I've found myself taking portraits more often than not at people's homes, as opposed to in a studio or in other places where there's lots of space. So I've had to really kind of condense it down so that I have a very small footprint, which is why I use the collapsible backgrounds and the lights also that don't have cables everywhere, because when you're working in confined spaces, certainly when you're photographing elderly people, the last thing you want, actually with anybody, is to have cables trailing all over the place. So that's what I've kind of done there. But one thing I'll say about the lighting as well is what makes working in small confined spaces a lot easier is when you are very, very familiar with that particular lighting style. My kind of mentality years ago was the fact that I seemed to feel every time I had a photo shoot, I had to change something about the technicals each and every time. So for example, if last Saturday I had a photo shoot and used one light, for some reason I thought this coming Saturday when I have another photo shoot, I've got to use two lights or just do something different. And what I very quickly started to realise, again over the last few years, is that it's not the technicals that need to change, it's just the content. So by me sticking with the same lighting style, not necessarily for absolutely everything, but predominantly sticking with this lighting style, it's meant that I've become extremely comfortable with it. Now, of course, there is always more to learn, but you know, that's a great thing. But the great thing is constantly doing that same kind of lighting style has many advantages. And one of them is the fact that you can then adapt to whatever environment you're in. For example, with this particular photo shoot you can see here where I'm photographing World War II veteran Laurie Whedon, who was a Horsa glider pilot in the Glider Pilot Regiment. Now, the only space we had in the beautiful home that he has, the only space I had to do the picture was in the galley of his kitchen. And ordinarily, as you've seen from the kit list there, I like to use a large octa for my style of portraits, but there just wasn't the space. But we know as photographers that when we have a small light source in close, it's going to give the same softness of light as a large light source further back. So it's little things like that that have helped me, certainly over recent times, to become a lot more relaxed and comfortable with my photography, which means I don't necessarily think about the technicals as much as I used to, which also means that I can then concentrate on the person. So again, just by going over the same kind of lighting style, getting familiar with it allows you to be able to think on your feet and adapt to the environment you're in. If you can't use a piece of kit you ordinarily would, you know you can use something else and still produce the similar result. So here's a few examples of actually photographing on location. Here I am photographing World War II veteran Harry Bailey. It's really comfortable, there's loads of space, loads of areas for us to move around in, and also for helpers to give us a hand. But then here you can see me photographing in a veteran's living room with limited space. Now this photograph is where I took probably the most challenging portrait I have done to this day because of lack of space. It was so tight that I couldn't get behind the camera, but instead had to lean the tripod back with the camera attached and have the back of the camera pressed against the wall. Technology such as face tracking and shooting tethered made this possible, because without it, I honestly don't know what would have happened. But now let's take a look at some other examples, because I'm always looking to take portraits, but they always seem to come up at times when you least expect them. But if you've got kit with you, there's always the chance to grab one. Now, I've always got a camera with me. It's not my main camera. It's a much cheaper camera, but it's still a camera. It's cheaper because if it gets stolen from the back of the car. Also with me, that's always in the boot of the car, is a speed light and a modifier, something like the Rogue Flash Bender. Now, I've used this kit to take portraits of dogs when I've been in a coffee shop. It wasn't planned, but having kit that is great for small spaces opens up endless possibilities. To take these shots, I used my invisible black background technique. I did a video of this over on my YouTube channel, but to take photographs, I'd hold the speed light and modifier above the dog and to one side. The camera, I'd flip out the screen, and because of eye focus, the camera locks on, so no matter where the dog moves, and boy will they move, the shot will be in focus. I've used exactly the same minimal setup when in a pub grabbing photographs of some of the local characters. Portraits taken at the bar where space is extremely limited. My wife holding the speed light to one side and forward of them, and job done. Now if you think that's really working in small confined spaces, this here really shows that it's not about how small the space is that you have to work in, but is everything to do with the kit that you use. This is going back a few years ago now when I was writing Photograph Like a Thief and recreating a portrait of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold wasn't available, so I photographed the very next best thing, an action figure. Using the very same speed light and the very same modifier, I was able to set things up so that it mimicked the exact same Rembrandt lighting setup I went through earlier. So hopefully this has shown you that if you've ever struggled with space when taking portraits, there is always something you can do to get the results you want. The key is practice. If you practice a lighting style over and over again, you become incredibly familiar with it, which means that you then know how to adapt it depending on what environment or location you find yourselves in. And when you can do that, creativity is limitless.